universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. When Richard Dawkins looks at the science behind the universe, he sees a great big signpost pointing us towards atheism. Is he right? Has science even disproved the Christian faith? Maybe you're a science major and you're struggling with how to reconcile what you hear in class with what you've heard in church. Perhaps you've been trying to share your faith in Jesus with your friends, and they're really not that interested, because as far as they're concerned, science has explained away the Christian faith. Maybe you're someone who's really wrestling with these questions, and you feel like no one else is really interested in the issues. This morning we're going to expose 3 myths around the area of science and faith. We're not going to come up with easy answers, but hopefully we'll find some tools that will help us as we navigate these questions for ourselves. So here's the first myth, and it's commonly believed both by Christians and by atheists. If science did something, then God didn't. Perhaps you think about the relationship between science and the Christian faith a bit like this. The more science, the less room there is for God. Well, let me ask you a question. Did God create you? Now, I'm a Christian, and so for me, the answer is emphatically yes. And now I'm going to tell you a secret. And it's pretty personal, so I don't want you guys tweeting this, okay? I'm 33 years old, and about 34 years ago, my mum and dad had sex. Okay, so it wasn't so much of a secret. When I told you I was 33 years old, you could pretty much guess for yourself that about 34 years ago my parents had sex. You may not have wanted to think about it. Now think back to high school biology. You may be a little hazy on the finer details, but we probably all remember the basic idea. There was a sperm, there was an egg, they came together. It made an embryo. That embryo had all the genetic information required to make a full human being. We pretty much know how babies are made scientifically. We may even have seen a video of it. I don't know if you remember those videos taken by those ridiculously small cameras inside somebody's womb. Now, who volunteers to have a video camera inside their womb? That really scares me, but I guess somebody did. We know scientifically how babies are made. And yet we say that God created us. We believe that he knit us together in our mother's womb. So this is the first myth that we need to expose. The idea that if science did something, God didn't. In reality, pretty much the reverse is true. You see, science is the way that God normally works in the physical world, upholding and sustaining his universe. Knowing more science doesn't mean we trust God less. It means we're thinking God's thoughts after him. So does this mean that God doesn't and can't step outside science? No. If you paid any attention over Christmas, you'll remember the question that Mary had for the angel Gabriel. How am I going to have this baby since I'm a virgin? So Mary knew the facts of life, and Gabriel's answer to her was useful information. With this baby, God was going to do things differently. So when we say that God normally works through science to achieve his purposes in the universe, we're not saying he doesn't act miraculously when he chooses to. But we are saying that we shouldn't only look for God in the bits that we can't explain away by science. We shouldn't just look for God in the gaps in our scientific knowledge. So next time a friend of yours or a professor points to a new discovery in science and says, look, yet another thing that God didn't do, don't be discouraged. If we believe the Bible, then God wrote the laws of physics. He planned the processes of biology. So studying science should be more like looking at a beautiful sunset. It should cause us to worship our Creator even more. So what's our second myth? This is my favorite one. My PhD is in English literature, so I'm kind of into this metaphor stuff. Our second myth is the idea that true and literal are the same thing. You may have heard Christians whom you respect saying that they take the Bible literally. The reason they're saying that is to safeguard the vital importance of taking our God at his word. And in a world of relativism where our friends would often say to us, well, you know, it's great that Jesus is true for you, but it's arrogant to say that he's true for anyone. We need to be sure that we are proclaiming the literal, historical life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But does that mean we should always take the Bible literally? Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. Do we expect him to be mostly hanging out with fluffy animals that go, bah? Or do we understand that Jesus is communicating something really important about his relationship with his people through that metaphor? Jesus said, I am the door. Do we think he meant that he is a wooden thing that swings on hinges that may need a bit of oil every now and again? No. We think that Jesus is saying that he is the only way into relationship with God. You see, true and literal are not the same thing, even when you listen to Jesus. Okay, so maybe there are times when it's obvious the Bible is not meant to be taken literally. But perhaps we can use that old Bible study adage that if the plain sense makes sense, seek no other sense. Let's apply this to the story of the Good Samaritan. When Jesus told that story, he didn't say, once upon a time, or I'm about to tell you a story, don't take it too seriously. He started telling his story. Was Jesus reporting an actual crime of robbery and assault that took place on the road to Jericho? Or was he using a story that may not have been founded in a particular historical circumstance to teach us about how we should treat those who society thinks we should have nothing to do with? You see, true and literal are not the same thing. I can use metaphorical language to tell you the truth, and I can use literal language to lie. If I tell you that my husband is a rock star, you'll take one look at me and conclude that he probably is not an actual rock star. But you won't tell me I'm lying, because you know that what I'm saying is he's a really great guy. If I tell you that my dad is a medical doctor, I'm using literal language, but I'm lying. He's not. And what about if I tell you that God is my father? I'm not speaking literally there, but I'm telling you one of the most profoundly true things that any human being can say. So how does this apply to Old Testament narratives? Well, like any good Facebook relationship, it's complicated. Here's an example I love. In Exodus 19, God says to his people, you see what I did in Egypt, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now raise your hand if you think God set a flock of giant eagles to pick up his people out of Egypt and deposit them in the promised land. Okay, we have a couple of people who maybe need to read their Bible a little more carefully. I'm pretty sure that no literal eagles were involved. But is God lying when he says that? Of course not. He's telling something profoundly true. Okay, so what about the creation accounts in Genesis 1 to 3? Well, faithful Christians disagree about exactly how we should read those accounts, what kind of literature they are. And I would encourage you all to read them for yourself, to look into some of the background, and to think through these questions for yourself. But don't assume from the outset that the literal reading is always the most faithful reading. As we've seen, for example, so far, it's not. And don't assume that before the insights of modern science that Christians have always read the Bible, and particularly the Genesis accounts, literally. You may have heard of St. Augustine, a theologian from the 4th century who is hugely respected and has been so ever since. He himself asked some questions about Genesis. For example, you may remember that the sun was created on day 4 in the Genesis accounts. And he asks this: before the appearance of the sun, in what sort of cycle could 3 days and nights be said to have passed? In other words, what does a day mean before the sun? Now, you may have heard Christians say that if you don't take Genesis 1 to 3 literally, you can't believe that Jesus literally rose from the dead. Well, Augustine makes pretty much the opposite point. When he warns Christians of his day back in the 4th century not to go up against non-Christians on questions of science that they might know more about. He says this: if they find a Christian mistaken in a field in which they themselves know well, and hear him maintaining his foolish opinions about our books, i.e. the Bible, how are they going to believe those books in matters concerning the resurrection of the dead, the hope of eternal life, the kingdom of heaven, when they think their pages are full of falsehoods on facts which they themselves have learned from experience in the light of reason? My friends, we need to be very careful in the statements that we make about science if we want our friends to take us seriously when we tell them that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, as I said, faithful Christians disagree about exactly how we should read these texts and exactly how we should respond to the scientific data concerning origins. But sadly, many pastors and apologists don't actually take the time to understand what the scientists are really saying, and they end up caricaturing the scientific theories. Or else they end up confusing the actual science with the atheistic worldview that people like Richard Dawkins put on top of it. And that brings us to our final myth. The idea that scientists are atheists. That all the leading scientists who've come up with these challenging theories are probably people who reject God. In fact, this is very far from the truth. Guess what these 12 MIT professors have in common? They are all serious Christians who believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And there are actually more at MIT and many, many more at all sorts of other top universities. You see, listening to someone like Richard Dawkins, you may think that everyone agrees evolution is incompatible with the Christian faith and has disproved Christianity. But meet Francis Collins. Francis Collins was the head of the Human Genome Project, which mapped out the entirety of our DNA. He is now director of the National Institute of Health. He's probably the most powerful scientist in this country, an evolutionary scientist, and he became a Christian when he was a junior doctor out of a totally secular family. Why? Because he was challenged by the way that his Christian patients wrestled with suffering and depended on Jesus in their suffering. You may have heard of Stephen Hawking and even read his latest book, The Grand Design, where he argues that there is no longer any need to see God in the beginnings of the universe. Well, meet Joan Centrella. She's deputy director of astrophysics at NASA, studies similar things to Stephen Hawking. And she became a Christian as an adult. She's one of many leading scientists who are Christians in that field. Or perhaps you've read Steven Pinker, Harvard psychologist, in the New York Times, writing about how psychology of religion has explained away faith. Well, meet Justin Barrett. For many years a professor at Oxford, widely recognized as the father of evolutionary psychology of religion. And he is a Christian. He's now actually a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary. These are just 3 examples of a large number of Christians who are world-class experts in all sorts of scientific fields. Surprisingly, it's actually easier to find Christians who are science professors than who are professors in the arts and humanities. One of the great blessings that I have working for the Veritas Forum is that I get to meet some of these people and to hear their stories of faith and how they not only put together their science with their faith, but actually how their faith in Jesus motivates them to do their science. My friends, these are complex issues, and we're not going to find quick, easy answers to them. But maybe the witness of these kinds of people can help us to get a glimpse of the fact that we don't necessarily have to choose between a serious faith in the God of the Bible and the scientific discoveries of the last few hundred years. If you're interested to learn more about this, to hear more about Christians who are leading scientists, both today and in the history of some of the ideas that are typically seen as in opposition to the Christian faith, be it evolution or the Big Bang or the multiverse, for those who are a little more technical, do come and join me for the seminar afterwards. Please bring your doubts, bring your questions, bring your ideas. Let's work through this together and start the process for each of us of thinking through how we're going to read God's word faithfully and put it together with the other parts of knowledge that we're receiving. Thank you.